I'm Amy Ziegert. I want to welcome everybody today. I'm one of the instructors of the CISAC Honors Program. On behalf of my instructional partners in crime, Professor Rod Ewing and Dr. Esfandiar Mir, I want to welcome everybody to today's honors thesis presentations. A special thanks to all of our faculty advisors who have been an instrumental part of this process, and you're going to be seeing and hearing from a lot of them today too. I know we have a number of faculty and fellows and family and friends and members of the CISAC community zooming in today and dialing in from all over the place. I think Antigone has maybe the award for the most number of relatives joining us today. I want to welcome all of you here. Today is part finish line celebration and part pit stop for our honors thesis students. You're going to get a sense of the great work that these students have been doing for almost a year now, but they're not done yet. So they have a lot more work to do, and the Q&A and discussion that we're going to have today can be a really valuable input to them as they finish their theses in the next few weeks. We're going to have three presenters today: Antigone Xenopoulos, Kelly Devens, and Jonah Glick-Unterman. Let me just say, for all of you joining us here, what we're trying to do is to keep a classroom feel as much as we can. So what you'll see on the screen is the members of our class, our students, our teaching team, and the faculty advisors. All the rest of you who are joining in, you can see us, we can't see you, but we hope you'll contribute to our seminar today as well. Our format is going to be each student is going to speak for about 20 minutes. Then we'll have 10 minutes per student for Q&A and discussion. And as is our custom in the honors program, the faculty advisors get to ask the first question. Then we'll turn it over to students in the class who will ask questions. And for everybody, most of you know the drill, but I want to make sure everybody understands how this is going to work. We're going to ask that you raise your hand physically so that Dr. Mir and I can see you and we can call on you. So if you're in the class and on the screen, faculty advisor, just raise your hand and we'll make sure to get you in the queue. Everyone else is welcome and we encourage you to send your questions as well. There are two ways to do this on Zoom, for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with Zoom. Both of them are at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you'll see two little tabs at the bottom, one called Chat and the other called Q&A. You can just type in your question in either place and those questions will be sent to us. So if you're in the class, just raise your hand. If you want to send a question from afar, further afar, just type your question into the Q&A or the Zoom tab. Now we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. Just two other program note reminders for everybody. We're going to go back to back through our three presentations. So we will not be breaking in between our student presentations. And then just a reminder to our students today, make sure to turn off your share slides when you're done so we can see everybody on the screen. So we're going to start with Antigone Xenopoulos, just a little bit about her. Antigone is majoring in symbolic systems and economics. Her hometown is New York City. She's, like all of our honors students, very active at Stanford among her many activities. She was executive editor of the Stanford Review, and she helped design a Stanford course on ethics, public policy, and technological change. After graduation, she's headed to KKR, and her thesis advisor, who I understand is incredibly difficult, is me. So with that, Antigone, the floor is yours.
Great. So I'll just share my screen. Can you all see it? Okay, great. So thank you all for joining this afternoon. Today I'll be presenting my thesis titled Alliance or Vulnerable Reliance, U.S. Dual-Use Dependence on China. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to say thank you to the wonderfully supportive CISAC Honors Seminar teaching team, including Dr. Mir, Dr. Ziegert, and Dr. Ewing. And I'd also like to pay a special thank you to Dr. Ziegert, who's been my ever supportive and helpful advisor over the past 3 years. The past has shed light on the U.S.'s dependent Chinese manufacturing. Headlines like these from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal point to the U.S.'s desperate and urgent need for masks and PPE made in China. Beyond these examples of medical equipment, the U.S. also depends on China for its growing share of pharmaceutical manufacturing. And while the COVID-19 pandemic may have brought these issues of dependency to the public's attention, the current sense of urgency and crisis, it's nothing new. This dependence extends beyond the pharmaceutical industry and beyond medical equipment. The US depends on Chinese manufacturing for a number of critical dual-use products. These are products which have both defense and commercial applications. Take rare earths, for example. Rare earth metals are critical inputs for missiles, munitions, and many other weaponries. China controls 85% of the entire globe's processing capacity for this critical material. We see a similar situation with lithium-ion batteries. China dominates the entire supply chain, from raw materials to assembly components to final products of lithium-ion batteries, which are called by some the batteries of the future. These are just some examples of to explain in my thesis. In my thesis, I posed the question, why has the US become economically dependent on China for its supply of critical dual-use products? Why would the United States, a hegemonic and incumbent power, become so reliant on China, a rising and now rival power, for goods that are not only in deep demand, but are critically necessary for its military preparedness? In my research, I ultimately find that government dynamics matter more than private sector dynamics in explaining this phenomenon. And in the remainder of this presentation, I'll be making that case. Just for background, dual-use products are those which have both military and commercial uses, and they need to be developed for military use and then applied to commercial uses, or vice versa. For a roadmap, I'll first provide evidence of this trend of dependence, which I'm describing and analyzing. Then I'll discuss the relevant literature and scholarship to my thesis and the hypotheses I pose to explain dual-use dependence. Finally, I'll discuss my research design, my findings, and the implications of my conclusion. While there are a number of newspaper articles that talk about China's growing control over strategic industries and US's increasing dependence upon China, I didn't want to take these news articles as Bible. Rather, I sought to establish this trend of dual-use dependence on my own and using my own empirical analysis. To do so, I looked at 4 dependencies on 4 dimensions, and I'll just touch upon this. I'm not going to explain every single case I looked at. I do so much more thoroughly in my written thesis, but I wanted to give an example of this quantitative analysis because it's quite critical in motivating the research I'm doing. So I selected 4 dual-use products: lithium-ion batteries, printed circuit boards, pharmaceuticals, and rare earths. And I selected these 4 specifically because they're cases in which the US depends heavily on Chinese manufacturing, and they come from a broad selection of industries. So by looking at these 4 specifically, we get good insight into both the breadth and the depth of US dependence on China. Then for each of those 4 products, I looked at the degree of dependence through 4 lenses. So first, I examined the degree of dependence. What share of global manufacturing of the product does China drive, and what share of US imports of that product does China provide? Identify the product. So in some cases, the concern is merely a fear of a supply chain disruption in the heat of a geopolitically tense moment, or in a crisis like the coronavirus pandemic presents. In other cases, the concern is more complex and has to do with a fear of tampered or counterfeit or faulty products being delivered to the United States from China. Then finally, I looked at alternative supply sources. So if the US sought to decrease its reliance on China and moved its supply sources away from China, where else could it get this product, and how feasible would such a shift be? By looking at these 4 cases of dependence and through these 4 lenses, I ultimately demonstrated that US dual-use dependence on China is concrete, it has grown with time, and it's present across industries and defense applications. Look at the chart on the left, for example. This chart shows the US's precipitously falling share of global rare earth mining over the last 2 decades. While the US share of global rare earth mining has been falling rapidly, China's has been growing staggeringly. By 2010, China produced 98% of all rare earth ore in the world. We see a similar situation in the pharmaceutical industry. The graph on the right shows China's growing share of US imports of various generic drugs. And we see this, that's especially significant because there's not a single manufacturing plant in the United States. 37% of all penicillin consumed here comes from China. Similarly with ibuprofen, in 2001, China provided less than 1% of US imports of, China provided less than 1% of, in 2001, China provided less than 1% of US imports of ibuprofen, and by 2018, it provided 95%. So whether it's these cases of rare earth metals or pharmaceuticals or others that I looked at in my written thesis, it's quite evident that the US depends on China for a number of critical goods. So having established that this trend exists, I now ask, why is this the case? Since I'm looking at US dependence on China, it seems clear to me that the literature on interdependence and on US-China relations would offer good insights, and they do. These literatures together tell us why US dependence on China matters and therefore why it's worth studying in the first place. However, there are limitations to the insights that these literatures offer. For example, the scholarship on interdependence thoroughly discusses the effect of interdependence on interstate relations, asking questions like, does interdependence promote or deter hostility, and can interdependence be weaponized, or is it a source of cooperation? However, the interdependence literature does little to explain why interdependence comes to be in the first place. Then I looked at the literature on US-China relations. The US-China relations literature does a great job at explaining specific tensions within the relationship, like those pertaining to Taiwan, as well as positing as to what the future of the relationship will look like. Will China and the US inevitably go to war, or is cooperation a continuable path? However, this literature provides minimal insight into the crucial economic and security interests that have shaped US-China relations over the last few decades. So given these gaps in the literature, my own scholarly contribution will be first to explain how interdependence between the US and China has come to be, and second, how economic and security interests have influenced the relation through time. I should clarify that while economic motives like cost-cutting and profit-seeking are of course important to my thesis, I don't seek to explain them myself. Rather, I consider this to be context. So yes, offshoring and the shift of manufacturing from the US and China is a necessary precondition for my thesis. And without that trend, there would likely be no dual use dependence on China to be talking about in the first place. But I'm not trying to explain the economic factors or the commercial factors which drove manufacturing in the US to decrease and manufacturing in China to increase. Rather, I'm more interested in this phenomenon from a policy perspective. So I ask, given this trend of increasing dependence on China, why didn't the US government mitigate or attempt to reverse this trend? I propose 3 hypotheses to explain this phenomenon. The first is threat salience. And this is the hypothesis that the low salience of the threat posed to the US by China and by foreign reliance within the defense industrial base led to a low prioritization of dual use dependence on China as a policy issue. Second hypothesis is bifurcated bureaucracies. And this is the hypothesis that the poor integration of economic and security policy and policymaking bodies exacerbated this dependence by letting it sort of fall through the cracks. Third, interest group influence. This is the hypothesis that interest groups either push for legislation which weakens strategic US industries to foreign competition, or lobbied against legislation which would have protected them from this foreign competition. And in my thesis, I ultimately placed these 3 hypotheses against one another in an effort to determine which most compellingly explains US dual-use dependence on China. In terms of my research design and methods, I use quantitative analysis to explain trends of dependence, which I touched on earlier. I use process tracing. In terms of evidence, I look at evidence from both the private sector and the public sector, since both are relevant to economic competition. And in terms of government reports specifically, I looked at every single one of the reports listed below. For example, the Worldwide Threat Assessment and the National Security Strategy from 2001 to the present. I also looked at government official speeches, trade data, and more in order to gain insight into this question. I found this hypothesis to be as a national security threat. For example, the commissioners of the US-China Commission wrote in 2007 that they sought to raise a caution flag about the integrity of the United States defense supply chain and the degree to which it may be dependent upon components from China. The commissioners then urged the Senate and House Armed Services Committees to conduct investigations into how much the US military depended on China to be ready and able to deploy. So this evidence suggests that the government did recognize that dependence on China was a problem. However, China itself was not prioritized as a security threat. The table below includes rankings from the Worldwide Threat Assessment of the primary, regional, and global threats posed to the United States over various years. It's worth noting that only in 2016 was China listed as the primary #1 global regional threat posed to the US. And until 2013, the global threats that the US was preoccupied with did not implicate China. We were thinking about terrorism, for example, which does not relate to China, and only in 2013 did the focus turn to cyber, a global threat which does involve China. This empirical evidence suggests that the US was not focused on China as its primary security competitor until well into the Obama administration. In addition to these ranks of threats, it's also worth looking at how China was portrayed by US policy and policymakers. So during the Bush era, the tendency was to describe China as a responsible stakeholder, which the US welcomed to the world stage. The 2006 QDR, for example, states that US policy seeks to encourage China to choose a peaceful path of economic growth and political liberalization. This language suggests that China was viewed as a sort of benign rising power, rather than a state that the US would face threats from in the future. With the advent of the Obama era, we of course saw a shift with the pivot to Asia and with the rebalance towards the Pacific. And while the Obama administration did acknowledge specific tensions within the relationship, like those related to IP theft or violation of WTO rules, the emphasis was largely on cooperation rather than on competition between the US and China. So for example, the 2015 National Security Strategy stated that the scope of our cooperation with China is unprecedented. Only towards the late Obama administration and with the advent of the Trump administration do we begin to see more explicit recognition of the significant threat that China poses to the United States. The 2017 National Security Strategy, which is considered to be a key turning point in US national security strategy, states that China challenges American power, influence, and interests, attempting to erode American security and prosperity. That's language that was quite atypical of the Bush era and the Obama administration. So piecing all of this evidence together, I infer that while entities across the US government recognized that dual-use dependence on China was a problem and a threat to national security, because China itself wasn't a primary security threat or considered a primary competitor, this issue wasn't prioritized within policymaking. My second hypothesis was bifurcated bureaucracies. And in this hypothesis, I posited that a poor integration of economic and security policy exacerbated dual-use dependence on China. To validate this hypothesis, I looked at the government on two levels. First, I looked at government bodies which formulate policy in the White House, and then bodies which core policy, meaning unit departments, to determine to what degree were the security policymakers considering economic issues in forming policy, and to what degree were the economic policymakers considering security policy in their own work. Ultimately found that structurally, while integration of economic and security policy has improved over the last decade, it has been lagging in speed, depth, and scale. For example, the State Department position of Office of the Chief Economist was only introduced in 2012, and the DoD Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis, which is responsible for analyzing and identifying commercial threats posed to the defense industrial base, was established as late as 2018. More substantively, when economic tools have been considered in US foreign policy, the focus has been traditionally on offense rather than on defense, meaning that the government thought about how the US could leverage its economic strength against its partners by encouraging economic engagement and pursuing new trade deals, or to punish our adversaries by implementing sanctions against them. But there was little acknowledgement, at least publicly, of the need to anticipate defending ourselves against the economic coercion of other states. So given this evidence, and given that the issue of dual-use dependence sits integrated nature of US economic and security policy and policymaking both contributed to this. My final hypothesis, interest group influence, was that interest groups either push for legislation which weakens strategic US industries to foreign competition, or lobbied against legislation which would have protected them and given them preference over foreign manufacturers. And the logic of this hypothesis was that American multinationals benefit from globalization, from offshoring, and from cheaper labor abroad, and therefore would lobby against any efforts to give preference to US manufacturers over foreign manufacturers, and would push legislation that allowed for or even encouraged manufacturing. An evaluation of this hypothesis would look at every industry for which the US depends on China and evaluate the role of interest groups in shaping manufacturing and trade policy within it. But such an analysis is not within the spec to push for offshoring and free trade and oppose preference given to American manufacturers. For this tough test, I selected the electronics industry because its supply chain is highly globalized and it maintains a very strong production footing in China. To my surprise, I found that the primary industry association representing the global electronics industry did not push for policies which furthered dependence on China. Instead, the electronics industry, moreover, the association actively supported government efforts to revitalize US manufacturing and strengthen the defense industrial base. So while this is but one case, and we can't completely generalize, this evidence suggests to me that interest group influence is not a key factor in driving dependence on China. I then looked at two other cases related to the commercial satellite industry and Huawei, and I selected these two cases because they're instances in which the US government has cited national security concerns in its decision to restrict trade and commerce, and has made this decision in spite of interest group lobbying and at the cost of American firms. So together, this evidence suggests that interest groups were not a primary factor in driving US dependence on China. There are a number of implications that stem from my thesis, but I'll just name a few. First, it appears that democracies respond poorly to slow-growing and cross-cutting threats. Moreover, economic and security interests must be weighed together. While there's a tendency in both scholarship and in policy distinct fields, such a viewpoint is quite impractical in the era of a great power competition, wherein China is both our primary security and economic competitor and rival. Third, structure shapes policy. While this may seem obvious, it's important to note that the way in which we structure our bureaucracies directly determines who contributes to what policy and what considerations are prioritized in certain policies. And fourth and finally, the United States must protect itself from the economic statecraft of other powers. While the US is the center of the global financial system and still maintains the largest economy in the world, we're not immune from the coercion of other states. So yes, we should think about how to use our own economic strength to further our national security and foreign policy goals. But we should also be anticipating the need to protect ourselves against the potential manipulation from other states based on our own economic vulnerabilities. So, in summary, I found that dual-use dependence on China was recognized as a problem by the US government. But because China was not considered a primary threat or a security competitor, US dual-use dependence was not prioritized in policymaking. Additionally, the lagging integration of US economic and security policy and policy-making bodies exacerbated this dependence. But interest group influence does not provide a compelling explanation for this phenomenon. So ultimately, I conclude that government policy and bureaucracy explain US dual-use dependence on China more effectively than private sector factors like interest group influence do. Thank you.
Thanks, Antigone. Oh, and thank you for changing your slides so we can see everybody. So I'm just going to ask everyone to imagine that we're sitting in Encina Hall, and instead of having internet difficulty where you blanked out a little bit, but we could still see your slides, we had the leaf blowers in the background, which is more typically what we find in our seminar room. So fortunately, you came in and out a little bit, but your slides told the story when you couldn't. So great job. What I want to do is, since that's not your fault, I want to, since I ask you a lot of questions when we meet, I'm gonna steal a question from Morgan Kaplan from last week, who asked an excellent question of our presenters, and then I want to add to it. And Morgan asked, as you all might remember, what are the findings that surprised you or ran counter to what you anticipated when you first started the thesis? That's part one. And then part two is another question I haven't asked you, which is pushing you a little bit on the policy implications. If you were advising President Trump today, based on what you know, what would you tell him to do? So what surprised you? And then what would you do on the basis of your thesis to advise the president today about how to deal with dual-use dependence on China?
Sure. With regards to the first one, there were two quite surprising findings. So when I set out on my research, I originally anticipated that, well, I expected that there would have been a low priority given to the threat posed by China, and that was true. But I also expected that the threat posed by dependence on anyone, let alone China, was sort of underestimated. And I thought that the US military, because of its historical strength, had been underestimating sort of low-lying threats like that. But surprisingly, I found that there were sort of flags raised both in Congress and within the DoD as well as elsewhere, recognizing that the military's dependence on foreign suppliers was a national security threat. So that's one finding. And then second, I expected to find that interest group influence was a key factor in driving this, namely because industry decisions to move abroad and industry benefits from offshoring and from free trade are quite pronounced. So I expected interest groups representing highly globalized industries to encourage offshoring and sort of dismiss any efforts to revitalize American manufacturing. But as I discussed towards the end of my presentation, I found evidence counter to that. So those were two very interesting findings. And if I were to advise President Trump on US dual-use dependence on China today, I would say that,
You're back on.
Sorry about that. If I were to speak to President Trump today, I would say that while import bans may temporarily sort of give ease or preference to American manufacturers over our competitors, that such a solution is very temporary and doesn't actually solve the fundamental problem at hand. So in terms of a long-run solution, I would urge efforts to reinvest in US manufacturing and incentives to revitalize the US's industrial base, especially in critical industries like the ones I named earlier.
Great. Well, Antigone, there are many people in the queue to ask questions. We're going to start with your classmates who have some questions, and then we'll go to some of our faculty and great questions from our audience. So in the queue, I have Andrew, and then Eva, and then Brian.
Thank you, Antigone, for a really fascinating presentation. I'm curious, you identified problems with the structure of US government and the bureaucracy, specifically with security and economic issues. So I'm curious, if you were able to sort of wave a magic wand and restructure the bureaucracy, how would you recommend doing so to address that problem?
That's a very good question. My statement by saying that I'm not an expert whatsoever, but some ideas I have had in conducting my research were, first, it seems, I personally believe that the treatment of the National Economic Council and the National Security Council as distinct bodies, I think is somewhat impractical in the current era, where, at least in terms of our international policy, not our domestic policy, but in terms of our international policy and our global concerns, I think the economic and security threats post the United States are quite intermingled. So that's one that I would comment on. Dr. Ziegart and I were speaking about this just earlier today. But I would say that if the intersection of economics and security were given enough importance throughout these cabinet agencies, we would likely see either this integration being considered sort of at a high level by department leaders throughout the department. But I found that in many cases that there was either a lack of consideration at a high level or it was in a very specific part of the department. So I would urge a consideration of economics and security at a sort of higher bureaucratic level within cabinet.
Antigone, I think we lost you there for just a second, but let's, in the interest of time, and I know I want to make sure we get to a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask Eva and Brian, ask if you can, a concise question, concise answer, and then we'll move on, because I know I've got Mike McFall that's got a, you know, he's got a very softball question for you. Eva.
Great. Yeah, so Professor Ziegart kind of stole my question, which was going to be, so we have these insights about how dependence happen, what do we do next? So, but pivoting a little bit from my original question, your thesis really hinges on dual-use technology manufacture. And I was wondering, from the perspective of dependence on China for dual-use research, whether you think, you know, you haven't done this research, but off the top of your head, whether you think that the competition in dual-use research was also maybe fostered by some of the same elements, or had other factors or other hypotheses you could think of?
Yeah, so I would say that it's probably somewhat different because I think whereas manufacturing, can you hear me? Oh,
yeah, we hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say that I think it's quite different because whereas manufacturing is probably a zero-sum game in terms of being mainly profit driven, I think scientific research is not a zero-sum game and benefits hugely from international cooperation. I would say that perhaps of the sort of increasing importance of Chinese dual-use research, but to be honest, I'm not familiar enough with the subject to say much on it.
Yes. My question was just about hypothesis formulation. I was curious if you could discuss a little bit more about how you came up with your different hypotheses for your thesis. And I'm particularly interested in your interest group hypothesis, given that my thesis deals with similar topics.
So I would say I did quite a lot of reading in the fall about sort of the last few decades of US-China relations, the role of economics and security, and this field called sort of economics and security. So I would say that my reading on US-China relations is what drove the first hypothesis about sort of threat perception. And then my reading on the return of geoeconomics, I call it that, drove the second hypothesis about bureaucratic dynamics. And then in terms of the interest group influence one, I read a particular book which discussed the evolution of US export to China. That's the but it made a very compelling case that interest groups have had a significant role in shaping US export policy towards China. So that's where the interest group hypothesis came from. But I thought they sort of nicely fit together because one facet was sort of this, the other was structural, and then the final one had to do with how the private sector influenced the public sector.
Okay, so Dr. Sig Hecker has had his hand up for a while. Sig, I think we lost Sig for a minute, so why don't we go to Dr. McFall?
Thanks for letting me be here. Good to see you, Antigone.
You too.
My question is very simple. What if Secretary Clinton had won the election in 2016 and she brought somebody like Tom Donilon or Mike Froman to be the national security advisor instead of H.R. McMaster? Would the policy have changed, and would the threat assessment have changed or not?
I think the policy likely would have changed because while Secretary Clinton, during her time in the State Department, did place a renewed emphasis on economics within U.S. foreign policy, I think had the sort of bomb era geopolitics continued, the competition between the U.S. and China would not have come to sort of such a fore. But I personally believe that regardless of whether the U.S. and China were in an explicitly tense moment like we are now, or a sort of underground competition, that the problem of dependence would still be pronounced. I don't think to depend so heavily on other countries' manufacturing for, yes, rare earths and our weaponry preparedness, but I mean the U.S. dependence on China for pharmaceutical products, like we've been seeing during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that's hugely consequential. And regardless of whether a country is your rival or a partner, I don't think it's responsible to have insufficient domestic production for such critical goods. I mean, we wouldn't depend on another country for our wheat supply or dairy or oil if we could avoid it. And I think a similar logic should apply to the goods I was discussing in my presentation.
I think we have a little bit of time to go to our audience. We have Jonathan Littman was first in line. Quick off the bat for our Q&A. He has two questions. I'm going to take moderator's privilege just to ask one of the two so we can see if we can get to other folks. He asks, in one of your early graphs, you showed there was an uptick in domestic production of rare earth minerals in the last few years. Is that a fluke, or is that representing some recent policy interventions? How do you explain the change of rare earths?
Yeah, so that was not a fluke. The United States for the last few decades has only had one functioning mine that has been mining rare earth ores. It's called Mountain Pass, and it's in California, or it's in Mountain Pass, California, excuse me. And the mine closed in 2008 and reopened in 2016. I don't believe the reopening was directly a result of policy. I don't believe they received investment from the government, but it's sort of been in line with government efforts to revitalize domestic manufacturing of rare earth ores.
And then I think we have time for one more question, and it comes from Jake Dow, a former CISAC honors student himself, someone you've been working with, I know, Antigone, and he's asking about your perspective of the private sector. How has the private sector responded to its understanding of interdependence risks and weaponization of interdependence that we've seen, particularly animated by the COVID-19 crisis, but just more generally? How do you think about the private, you focus on the public sector, what's your sense of private sector response to the current state of interdependence?
Yes, so I would say that the realization of the instability caused by such deep interdependence probably came with the trade war prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think there's an increasing understanding within the private sector that basing your supply chain in such a concentrated fashion in one country, i.e. China in the last few decades, poses a risk because relying on one place just presents vulnerabilities if anything arises, be it war or a pandemic like now wherein factories have to be shut down. So I would say that it will probably take a while to come to fruition, but I think over the last few years, American companies have begun to reconsider their heavy reliance on Chinese-based factories and have attempted to sort of disperse their manufacturing and not necessarily shift it from China to one other place, but rather distribute it. That way it's possible to sort of minimize or maximize coverage and minimize vulnerability to any particular disruption.
So I can't let this go without tying it into another question, because it's directly on this point about private sector responsibility. So you talked about supply chains for private sector for their own firms' benefits. This question from Gil Kornberg, what responsibility, if any, should these private sector firms, particularly leading firms, have with respect to dual use dependence on China? Is there a responsibility that they need to play, not just for their own shareholders and their own bottom line, but for the nation and national security?
This is a subjective take, but I personally believe that there are a number of companies, whether they're technology companies or more traditional manufacturers, which are American companies and therefore should have some sort of allegiance to the United States, not only because they're located here, but I should also point out that there is a reason that companies are headquartered in the United States and rather than elsewhere in some cases. So I personally believe that there is some sort of responsibility to decrease dependence on China for national security purposes. However, I wouldn't personally expect the private sector to take that upon itself unless there was sort of a fundamental shift in terms of the role that companies play in the United States and within our sort of national security. So I think in order for that sense of responsibility to actually be acted upon, there would likely, on a social basis, in terms of what is expected from companies and what role they play in our country, or in a policy perspective, incentivizing companies to actually act on that responsibility to decrease dependence.
Well, thank you, Antigone, and thanks to everybody who sent in your questions. Well done. We get Zoom applause. And apologies to those whose questions I couldn't get to. So next up, we have Kelly Devens. While Kelly's getting her slides ready to share, I'll just say a little bit about her. She is a majoring in mechanical engineering. Her hometown is in Virginia. Kelly has been very involved in musical theater and in the performing arts at Stanford when she's not actually making things as an engineer. After graduation, she will be moving to Seattle, where she'll be a program manager at Microsoft, and her thesis advisors are Professor Rod Ewing and Ambassador Steve Pfeiffer. Kelly, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. So can everyone see my slides all right? Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Devens, and today I will be discussing my thesis, Assessing Russian Noncompliance in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, also known as the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty was a landmark bilateral arms control agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, signed nearing the end of the Cold War in 1987. It eliminated the development, testing, and deployment of all conventional and nuclear missiles that are ground-launched and fly to intermediate ranges, or 500 to 5,500 kilometers. The treaty was lauded for its substantial contribution to disarmament efforts, as it prompted the most dramatic nuclear arms reduction of the Cold War. It also introduced innovative and intrusive verification measures that were in place until the end of the inspection period in 2001, as well as the creation of the Special Verification Commission to address compliance concerns. However, the confidence in the treaty began to weaken starting in 2014 when the United States publicly accused Russia of violating the INF with its 9M729 missile system. While both parties met several times over a five-year period to discuss treaty compliance, the United States ultimately announced its suspension of obligations to the treaty on February 2nd, 2019, and provided Russia 6 months to return to compliance. The Russian government also suspended its obligations, so the INF was officially disbanded on August 2nd, 2019. My research centers on the following question. Why was Russia motivated to develop the 9M729 missile? The United States and NATO both independently determined that this system was in violation of the INF Treaty. So why did the perceived utility gained by developing the system supersede the risks and political costs of violating the treaty? One major component in asking these questions is determining which of the internal and external contributing factors were an impetus for this decision versus what is used as political justification. I find that ultimately a combination of factors led to the desire to have this missile, and it was unlikely created for one specific mission. However, traditional and emerging threats in Eurasia were the primary catalysts. In order to take you through that argument, I will first be discussing my literature review and development of my hypotheses. Next, I will explain my research design and empirical analysis, followed by major conclusions and the implications of this work. So my literature review surveyed and synthesized the pre-existing rhetoric surrounding the INF Treaty amongst academic literature and the media. I produced 4 hypotheses presenting potential explanations. First, perception of military threats from traditional sources, meaning the United States and NATO. I discussed the threat of US missile defense systems in Europe, as well as the collective superiority and expansion of NATO. Second, perception of military threats from emerging sources, namely China and the proliferation of these weapons to neighboring states in unstable regions. Third, a desire to exert political and psychological power over Europe. It's possible that there were additional political and diplomatic aspirations behind this missile. Russia often looks for opportunities to interfere with NATO and so divide. So the goal of introducing this additional capability could have been to intimidate Europe and undermine NATO cohesion and support of the United States. However, since this program was developed in secret, it doesn't really act as an effective deterrent. Fourth, independent action by and influence of the Russian military-industrial complex. The Russian Ministry of Defense and the military industry wield a lot of power economically and diplomatically. It's well known that the Russian military industry were not happy with Gorbachev signing the INF. It's possible that they either initiated the project independently or exerted enough influence to convince political leadership that this missile was necessary. Russia also already had similar sea-launched missiles, so it would not require a substantial amount of effort to achieve these capabilities. Now, while my conclusion is better explained by considering all 4 of these hypotheses, I will only be going into a detailed analysis of the first 2 due to time constraints, but I'm happy to go into more depth in the Q&A. Now moving on to my research design. I employed a single case process tracing approach to parse my hypotheses. The time frame of interest was from the early 2000s through 2019. I developed 2 data sets, each explored in an empirical chapter. My first empirical chapter was an analysis of the dependent variable. My understanding the particular timing and nature of the violation provides a way to examine potential external or internal influences on Russia's decision to make the missile. The chapter details the technical information of the violation, how Russia tested the missile, and the specific treaty language that was violated by these actions. It also lays out a robust timeline of events surrounding the INF Treaty. This slide illustrates some of the key examples of Russian behavior related to the INF. 2004 was one of the earliest indicators that Russia was unhappy remaining in the INF Treaty after the Russian defense minister met with the US Secretary of Defense. Over the mid-2000s, President Putin and other leaders continued to comment on the drawbacks of the INF Treaty. The central idea was that the treaty was a Cold War relic that unfairly restricted the United States and Russia, while other countries were free to develop nuclear or conventional missiles of this type. While the exact year the 9M729 program started is unclear, it is estimated that Russia began development in the early to mid-2000s and testing in the late 2000s. Deployments began in 2017, and there are now at least 4 battalions and over 100 missiles deployed. The full timeline in this thesis details 60 events, including Russian actions and commentary, as well as the US's response and attempts to return Russia to compliance. To gather this data, I did a deep dive on official statements by the US, from House committee hearings to documents released by the State Department. 2 important primary sources were the 2018 report from the Director of National Intelligence and the 2019 compliance report. These provided critical, formally classified information that explained exactly what the Russian missile system was and how they violated the treaty. Now I'll discuss the mechanics of the violation, specifically relating to the flight testing. When the INF Treaty banned while the INF Treaty banned all ground-launched missile systems within this prohibited range, it did allow parties to test missiles from a fixed launcher as long as they did not ultimately intend to base those missiles on the ground, such as basing them on ships or an aircraft. Russia conducted 2 different flight tests. First, they flight tested the 9M729, a ground-launched missile to distances over 500 kilometers from a fixed launcher. This would have been fine if the 9M729 was an air or sea-launched missile. They then tested the same missile at ranges below 500 kilometers from a ground mobile platform. By putting these 2 tests together, they could test the capability to fly to INF prohibited ranges and launch from a ground mobile platform. They did this to obscure the classification of the missile and likely assume that parallel development of sea-launched INF range missiles would provide sufficient cover. Now moving into the second empirical chapter. My research has some limitations in that it is a very recent historical event. Much of the material detailing the intelligence that led to the United States' accusation remains classified. The lack of publicly released information and the secretive nature of Russia's decision-making presents two problems: inaccessibility of primary source material and the lack of means to verify claims directly. In order to best address these challenges, a lot of my evidence in the second chapter was gathered through interviews of experts. I conducted interviews with former high-ranking US government officials, American academics, European scholars, and Russian sources. They provided unique and highly valuable insights into the Russian mindset and how Russian leadership would realistically perceive a variety of internal and external triggers. The analysis of hypothesis 1 revolved around two major threats: NATO and US missile defense systems. A primary Russian military interest for having the 9M729 is to hold at risk, or in the case of a conflict, strike targets at significant ranges in Europe. Russia feels disadvantaged due to the eastward expansion of NATO and encirclement in key maritime domains. NATO remains significant quantitative and qualitative military advantages overall. Feeling these pressures, the ability to strike NATO targets with conventional warheads provides Russia military and political leadership options short of having to cross the nuclear threshold. A ground launch variant provides flexibility in addition to air and sea launch systems. Also a concern in Europe is the implementation of missile defense systems by the United States. This development catalyzed a lot of military modernization and expansion of Russian arsenals. The US withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ABM Treaty, in 2002 signifies a major turning point for the Russian government. This treaty limited ballistic missile defense systems in an attempt to curb the aggressive arms race between the two superpowers. While US missile defense programs were intended for use against the Middle East and not Russia, the Bush administration's departure from the ABM Treaty and general disinterest in productive dialogue with Russia disrupted US-Russia relations, and it sent a message that arms control wasn't really a priority anymore for the United States. In a 2018 speech to the Russian Federal Assembly, President Putin introduced a plethora of new strategic weapons. He specifically said that these systems were developed in response to the US withdrawal from the ABM Treaty and, quote, the practical deployment of American missile defense systems. Putin said that responding to the expansion of American anti-ballistic missiles was necessary because, unchecked, eventually it would have resulted in the complete devaluation of Russia's nuclear potential. Clearly, Russia took an aggressive approach to developing new systems starting in 2002. The 9M729 may have very well been a product of this robust expansion, or at least benefited from the increasing approval of missile programs during this time. The timeline also fits, as scholars believe that the program has been under development for 15 to 20 years. Essentially, shifts in the security environment in Europe create a desire to use or defend against intermediate range missiles in this theater. The analysis of hypothesis 2 centers on China and the proliferation of these weapons to other states. Third-party actors have become increasingly important to US-Russia relations and the INF Treaty. Since the end of the Cold War, the world has experienced a shift to a multipolar security environment, increasing the number of threats for which Russian political and military leaders must consider and plan. First, a look at China. Throughout the interviews, the topic of China and its classification as a threat to Russia was a major point of contention and prompted a variety of responses. Some claim that China is an immediate threat to Russia and its interests due to the nature of the relationship between China and Russia. However, expressing this publicly or broadcasting a more aggressive military posture in the Far East would be tricky. Others argue that China was not integrated into the Russians' calculations in a significant way. One source said that behind closed doors, most Russian officials are worried about the threat of China, but not in the next 2 to 3 decades. Therefore, perhaps China is a long-range threat politically, economically, and strategically, and a military consideration in the short term. Nations other than China also pose a potential military threat to Russia, but there exists debate over how seriously Russia worries about these states. Russian leaders have made several public comments about their concern that many other countries such as North Korea, South Korea, India, Iran, Pakistan, and Israel are free to develop these weapons. One expert claimed that this publicized frustration may actually just be a ploy to justify desiring an end to the treaty, signified by Russia's lack of real effort to negotiate or globalize the treaty. However, Russian geography dictates that the capability of states in Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East directly impact Russian security and strategy. The 4 known initial deployments of the 9M729 are shown here on this map. The 9M729 is estimated to have flown to a range of around 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers. The missiles in their current positions could reach Eastern and Northern Europe, as well as Central Asia and the Middle East. Russia's vast territory allows for flexibility, however. Further deployments in Eastern Europe, such as in Luga or Kaliningrad, and in the Far East would open up new targets in Western Europe and East Asia, respectively. Therefore, an increasing number of threats in several theaters presents a need to introduce new systems. After investigating each hypothesis individually, I found it relevant to consider how they interact with one another and play into a broader narrative. I developed a variety of questions to consider relevant historical and political context, and I will discuss some of them here. 1. What was the Russian government's attitude towards the treaty? Legacy resentment of the INF Treaty amongst the Russian military played a part in the decision to pursue the 9M729. When considering the geomilitary posture of each party, the agreement was very much in the interest of the United States. President Putin has described the treaty as a unilateral disarmament by the Soviet side, and many inside the military establishment view the signing of the INF Treaty as the peak of capitulation by President Gorbachev. 2. What value did these missiles add? While there is some debate over the added military value that the 9M729 provides Russia, introducing an additional class of missiles increases the quantity of potential response options and provides flexibility when faced with a potential conflict on multiple fronts. Russia was possibly attempting to secure escalation dominance in Europe, similar to the SS-20s during the 1980s, and those were the missiles that actually led to the creation of this treaty. Perhaps the missile developers simply wanted to have them, and they did not see a good reason not to have intermediate missiles in all 3 variants. 3. Who has the power in the Russian bureaucracy? The Ministry of Defense and the military-industrial complex, with the support of President Putin, wield a significant amount of power when dictating strategy and policy. This is in contrast to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example. The rationale behind the program largely appears to have been a military one, with other political and diplomatic contributing factors. Consequently, the uniformed officers and the military industry developers were jointly responsible for driving this program. However, they needed to gain political support to receive funding. 4. Did the government have a big plan for all of this? Although some freedom is granted to the Russian military-industrial complex when developing new programs, a system such as the 9M729 does not get developed and deployed without Putin's knowledge and authorization. The approval of the program likely hinged upon the assumption that it could be done with plausible deniability, in which the missile could be sheltered by concurrent testing and deployment of other treaty compliance systems. The Ministry of Defense and industry developers do not really view it as their job to concern themselves with the details, constraints, and ramifications of treaties. Therefore, the responsibility fell to the Russian Foreign Ministry, which was likely kept mainly in the dark. They did not plan on getting caught and therefore did not have a clear story prepared when the United States approached them in 2013. With that context in mind, I developed a narrative for what transpired in the Russian government that led to the creation of the 9M729. I concluded that while all hypotheses were influential, some were primary impetuses for this decision, while others were used as political justification. Concerns over the threat of NATO and European missile defense were the most influential, along with the ability to defend against emerging threats in Russia's southern and eastern regions. Interference with NATO was an added political benefit. The military-industrial complex, while a powerful driver, did not act independently to develop the system. Still, the 9M729 was likely not developed for any one mission in particular. The Ministry of Defense wanted the missile system to provide flexibility in response to an increasing number of military threats in several theaters. The military-industrial complex, which had been itching for this type of missile since Gorbachev signed it away, was happy to oblige and promised to develop it with plausible deniability. Over time, the nation's emphasis on missile modernization and shifts in the political and security landscapes eventually prompted leadership to determine that the rewards of having the system outweighed the risk of violating the treaty. President Putin and the Ministry of Defense pragmatically viewed this missile as one piece of the puzzle. It is not a cure-all, but Russia would rather have it than not. Instead of asking why Russia should have this weapon, consider why they should not have it. The only thing that held them back was, in their view, an outdated and unfair treaty that could soon be reaching the end of its life. By developing the system covertly, Russia acquired a competitive edge. If the Americans found out, the Russians can deny it, and the United States suffers from the political fallout if they pull out of the treaty. Now I will discuss the implications of this research on scholarship and policy. First, this is a novel contribution to the field. As this is a relatively recent event, I've been told that this analysis is the first of its kind in the public sphere. I created 2 new data sets that could be helpful in understanding the downfall of the INF Treaty. Second, on the public side, understanding the rationale behind developing a treaty non-compliant weapons system presents opportunity to consider how existing and future arms control agreements are developed and valued in practice. Furthermore, understanding the goals and perceived threats of the Russian military will better inform the United States' military posture in Europe and Asia, especially as it relates to intermediate range missiles. Now, I would like to thank my advisors, Ambassador Pfeiffer and Dr. Ewing, along with Dr. Ziegart and Dr. Mayer for their continual support, help, and advice this year. Thank you to all of my interviewees who are generously willing to take the time to speak to me about my thesis. Finally, thanks to my cohort, friends, and family for supporting me and putting up with my incessant rambling about Russian nuclear weapons for months on end. Thank you for listening, and I will now be taking questions.
Great job, Kelly. It takes a special kind, everyone's applauding, yeah, well, it takes a special kind of student to want to look at things like great power conflict and nuclear weapons for fun. So you're in good company, and it was a great job.
Thank you.
Our first question is going to come from Ambassador Pfeiffer, then we'll go to Professor Ewing, and then let me remind students, raise your hand either physically or electronically so I can get you in the queue. Ambassador Pfeiffer.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly. Great job. I think one of the things that hinder this work, of course, is a lot of the information is still classified, and obviously you couldn't get access to it. But in looking at the 4 hypotheses that you laid out at the beginning, I think you've come up with the right conclusion. But I'm curious, in talking to Americans and Russians, were they in general agreement, on your conclusion, or were there differences between how American experts saw the Russian motivation versus how the Russian experts saw it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of my concerns in this project, and thank you so much for connecting me with so many people, because that was really, really helpful to give me that kind of base of expert knowledge. I do admit that there is a bit of bias in this project because I have more access to American sources, especially, in Encina Hall. And so I was able to talk to a few European and Russian sources, as you mentioned. There was a little bit of a discrepancy, and I think it may be rooted a little bit more in terms of just how the Russian bureaucracy works and how, just how things function, who gets the most power, and thinking about the influence of the military-industrial complex. One of the different things was the influence of China, for sure. That was kind of across the board a little bit of a debate, and the few Russian sources that I had, they were kind of saying that for now they're in a strategic partnership with China, and maybe it's in the back of their minds, but they think that they're really deterred for now, and this kind of thing with China wouldn't be solved with just a few battalions of this missile anyway. And so there definitely were differences, and so that's something that I'm digging into in Empirical Chapter 2 right now, where I am trying to really analyze the perceptions and the previous experience of all the interviewees that I had, and how that informs their opinions.
Professor Ewing.
Right, Kelly, thank you for a very nice presentation. And I have to say how much I've enjoyed watching your thesis develop over the past nearly a year. And you've really taken the subject well beyond what I thought you would be able to do. My question is a different form of the question asked by Ambassador Pfeiffer. I'd ask you to use your imagination and imagine that you're a Russian student in a honors seminar at Moscow State University, making this presentation. Could you describe how the presentation might be different, or what parts of the presentation would be shaded in a different direction?
Certainly. Yeah, I I think that one of the caveats that is associated with some of this, and I went into it a little bit more in one of the empirical chapters, was that this kind of understanding, especially looking at the US missile defense systems and the ramping up of modernization and everything, there are different ways to kind of perceive Russia's their plan in life, I guess, of whether they are trying to actually, interfere with NATO and everything going on, or are they just being defensive to everything they're saying? The US is installing these things that messes with our strategic stability. And so I think it would depend upon that person's understanding of how Russia kind of falls in the world order, and whether they are trying to be more revisionist or just kind of doing their own thing. And so that definitely changes how aggressive Russia is in this kind of policy. I think Russia has not presently admitted to violating the treaty. And they did that for a couple different reasons. One was suggested to me that if they had admitted to this, then the Iskander, which is a different kind of missile, which is very important to Russia, they use those launchers. And so those would be like tainted if they used the 9M729 missiles in those. And then all of those would have to be dismantled as well. I spoke with a different government official who said, probably that wouldn't actually really be the case. We'd work with them to say we understand the difference between those, but that could have been a concern for them. And so whether or not they actually believe they violated the treaty or not, I don't know. But I think it would just be different in terms of Russia's posture in the security environment.
Okay, thank you.
Next, I have Professor Sagan.
That was excellent, Kelly. One reason to stay in an arms control agreement is that you're concerned about reciprocity, what an adversary would do. And while I found your story very compelling, I didn't understand whether, in your view, the Russians did not think that the United States could respond in kind, perhaps because of public opinion in NATO countries, or whether they didn't care. That is, their policy was worth it regardless of what the United States do. Could you explain what you think about that question?
Certainly. One of the interesting factors associated with this that I didn't get a chance to dig into during the presentation is that the Russian government has kind of been throwing around this proposal of a moratorium of these missiles in Europe, which I think is really fascinating because they have kind of backed themselves into a corner where they're not admitting that they have the missiles, but they want a moratorium of them in Europe. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting because I remember one article I read was that Russia can't afford another arms race, and if they did this and then the US would start doing it, then they would just amp up again. And it's kind of repeating history, because if you look at the Cold War and you think about the deployment of the SS-20s, and then we responded with the Pershing IIs, that escalation resulted in the INF Treaty. I spoke to Rose Gottemoeller, who's actually on this call, and she was saying that, they actually brought this up to the Russians, and they said, hey, this is just gonna create a lot of short warning times, and it's not good for any of us. But they didn't really care. I think part of it is a little bit leaning into this sort of aggressive posture, and them saying that we think that this was a failure of the Soviet Union, and it's it's a bad memory. We want to kind of undo what happened in the 80s. And another part of it is that in order for the United States to reciprocate in kind, they would have to have NATO countries willing to base these on their territory. And so far, no countries have kind of stepped up to that. And so I think it's a combination of them not caring, and they're just wanting it, and then maybe just handling that fallout later on if it comes up.
So I'm glad, Kelly, that you mentioned Rose Gottemoeller, because I have her next in the queue. And for those of you outside of Stanford, we're very lucky to have, as our paying distinguished visiting lecturer, Rose Gottemoeller, who came to us after being serving as the NATO Deputy Secretary General. So Rose, to you.
Thank you very much, Amy, and really good job, Kelly. I want to tell everybody that she was a very tough interviewer when she came to my office, and she had a very good and thorough list of questions to hit me with. But one thing I did want to ask you to speculate on a bit more, and it's a question that I ask myself all the time. Why did the Russians not reach for diplomacy on this? I think you're quite right. I think the MOD outran the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they had the blessing of Putin to do it. So I do think, that is a factor here. But they are actually very experienced and good negotiators, and normally they can wiggle themselves out of any bad situation, like getting the Iskanders captured in an attempt to bring them back into compliance with the INF Treaty. I think they and we could probably have figured that out. But after all the work you've done, why do you think they never really reached for diplomacy on this? Because it has been a great frustration, I know, not only for me, but for the current administration, that A, they never acknowledged the missile, and B, they just wouldn't talk about it except to begin to, put through these propaganda forays like the January exhibition of the missile at a shopping mall in Moscow. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, that is definitely something that's been kind of in the back of my head this whole time as well. I think initially, they maybe were just trying to get a head start on this. I think maybe at the time of its creation, there was a really bad economic crisis. There was no money in the defense system, and it was also at the time that the United States walked out on the ABM treaty. And so I think that there was maybe a kind of sense of, we kind of did them wrong and say, okay, well, if they don't care about that treaty, I mean, maybe we can just do this on our own, and by doing it first and by not doing it diplomatically, then they can have a leg up on us. I mean, just deploy them as they like and be ahead of the curve there. Yeah, it's interesting because in the negotiations, as you told me as well, they were not very willing to provide any sort of information. They even accused the United States several times, and I think in a kind of a way to deflect the different accusations against themselves. And so it's possible that eventually they sort of realized that they backed themselves into a corner when the accusations from the United States came out. People outside of the secret compartmentalized program kind of realized, oh, this isn't really something we can easily undo. And they were probably worried about what they could lose in this exchange, and decided just to go on their own. But that's my best guess at it.
So we've come to the speed dating round of our Q&A session. So what I'd like to do in the couple minutes we have left to get to as many as we can is collect the questions, and then Kelly, you can answer as many or as few in as depth or as little as you would like. Mm-hmm. So let's get three. I've got Samantha, and then Elena, and then Mike McFall. So ask your question, collect them, Kelly, and then you can have the last word. Samantha.
Hi, Kelly. Great presentation. I'd be interested to hear your opinion on the efficacy of future nuclear weapons treaties with Russia in the future, and whether you think that this is an appropriate policy option going forward.
Okay. Elena.
Great job, Kelly. So I'm wondering if your perception of the chain of events changed at all throughout your interview process, and how some of your preconceived notions going into the project were challenged.
Professor McFall.
So I think Antigone and Kelly should get together and write something together based on both of your hypotheses. And what I say that because I'm interested in, I asked about leaders to Antigone, and now I want to know about regime type, and play with the counterfactual. Antigone, for you, not now, but later for discussion between the three of us maybe, if China had become a democracy like everybody had projected, or some projected 30 years ago, would we have had a different threat perception? And Kelly, to you, is it just a spurious correlation that the beginning, the development of this new missile system is 2002, right as Russia is becoming more autocratic, or is it just the case that Russia is becoming more powerful? In other words, what role does regime type play in the assessment of threats? Why is Europe so threatening? Why is the United States so threatening to Russia in 2002 or 2019 when Russia didn't seem so threatened by the West in the 90s?
Okay.
So Kelly, in 20 seconds, the world.
Perfect. Okay, I'll start with the last question. I think it's interesting because in one of my interviews it came up that this was kind of the whole threat of NATO and the West to Russia was a little bit their own fault, because for a while they were saying, oh my God, NATO is such a threat, and NATO's over there like, I didn't think we were. I didn't think we were trying to actively threaten you. And then it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where then ultimately they did build up their forces, and then it is now this big problem for them. So I do think that regime type did have an influence in this, mainly in the way that they are thinking about their place in the world. The 2018 speech that I had from Putin was to the Federal Assembly was really, really intriguing. It talked about everything from infrastructure and education to military posture and new weapons. And it's just all about this kind of thing of, we are this new emerging power and we need to really inflict our power and our state in the world to everyone else. So I do think that is a factor. Are we at time, or should I try to go for a couple?
So I'm gonna violate the time thing myself, so you get a little bit more to answer, and then Bill Perry has a question. I'd be remiss if we didn't turn to our former Secretary of Defense to ask you a question about something he's very interested and knows a lot about. So finish up this, and then Bill, you get the last question.
Sure. Sam, I'll take your question. Yeah, I think this definitely has to be a consideration in the future as we are thinking about arms control. And there's talk now about, will we get a new INF again? Is it gonna be a trilateral agreement with China? The problem is a lot of these states do not, a lot of their defense systems and their offensive systems are intermediate range missiles, and it's a huge part of their arsenal, and they're just not willing or capable of giving those up. And so it does present something really tricky. We could try to get a little bit more creative about it and say, okay, you can have no nukes, but you could have conventional weapons, or try to do different things, or regionalize the world and say we're going to do different things in different parts of the world. I do think that the verification measures with the INF was a really great thing, and that since it ended in 2002, so maybe looking again and seeing what kind of measures we can implement similar to that would be a little bit more effective in long term.
Dr. Perry, you need to unmute.
Thank you. Am I coming now?
Yes.
Okay. That was a marvelous presentation, Kelly.
Thank you.
I want to go back to the 1980s when a somewhat analogous situation took place in Europe, which was finally brought to a head by our deployment of the SS-20s there. The difference in the situation now is we'll be willing to build the missiles and deploy them, but Europe might not be willing to make the deployment. That happens, that could lead to a very serious crisis in NATO. Mm. In fact, the question I have is perhaps the underlying strategy of Russia on this is a tactic for breaking up NATO. Mm. Think about that and just give you a reflection on that possibility.
Yeah, that was definitely something that was in my mind for the third hypothesis, where it creates this kind of concern amongst NATO of, who will allow us to base these missiles in Europe? If Russia has a missile in Luga missile base and it fires it at Germany, are we going to respond with other intermediate range missiles? Are we going to fire an ICBM at them? That kind of thing. So just an additional layer of nuclear missiles kind of capable of hitting Central and Western Europe just creates a lot of unease. And I think that was definitely an intention of them, where it's an added bonus to be able to kind of mess with NATO. However, I did hear, actually from Rose Gottemoeller again, that it was a very measured and calm response from NATO when they did act very cohesively. For a long time, NATO did not actually agree with the United States publicly about the INF weapon violation. However, over time, they were able to get enough information where they were in a position to agree with that assertion. But it definitely could change as there are more deployments, and we have to have a kind of discussion collectively as the NATO alliance to kind of figure out how to respond to this, instead of it being just a United States versus NATO versus Russia problem.
Great. Well, please join me in another round of applause for Kelly. Job well done.
Thank you.
Last but not least, we are turning to Jonah Glick-Unterman. So just a little bit about Jonah while he gets his screen share very quickly up. Jonah is a major in political science and comparative literature. His hometown is Chicago, Illinois. Like all of our honor students, been very active at Stanford. His activities include serving 2 terms as Stanford class president, and I think research assistant for almost every faculty member tuning into the class today. His advisors are Professor Scott Sagan and Professor Condoleezza Rice. Jonah, over to you.
Go. Thank you all for coming. Let's begin. Here we go. 1990 saw Iraq invade Kuwait. 1991 will see Iraq withdraw, preferably by choice, by force if need be. This was George H.W. Bush's warning to Iraq on January 5th, 1991, 2 weeks before the first Gulf War. My thesis investigates why some militarized threats, like Bush's or by any recent president, compel a change in an opponent's policy while others do not. The conventional answer to this question is that to be effective, a compelling signal should demonstrate a commitment to using force if necessary. Despite a number of game theoretic models and public opinion surveys on the topic, there are few studies of the historical record of signaling. For my thesis, I compiled the first data set of American compelling signals since strategic parity in 1970 until 2020, and I performed several case studies. My findings are that successful compellence is rare, and demonstrating an overwhelming commitment to using force might not make success more likely. In this presentation, I'll briefly define compellence and the conventional paradigm for understanding compellence signaling, which I call the costly framework. From this model, I'll derive hypotheses that should obtain. I'll describe how I built an original data set and report results that challenge the costly framework. Next, I'll turn to a case study on the effective international support for intervention during the lead up to the first Gulf War, and I'll conclude by identifying implications of my research for scholarship and policy. Compellence is a coercive strategy. Coercion uses threats of violence to strategically shape an opponent's decision-making. There are 2 types of coercion: deterrence, which threatens military action to dissuade an opponent from crossing a red line, and compellence, which threatens force to induce a change in policy. Now, when the United States makes a threat, an opponent has to decide whether to concede or resist, and thereby risk the chance of war. The literature almost unanimously agrees that an effective compelling signal should demonstrate a sufficient commitment to the use of force that makes the costs of resistance unacceptable. And Thomas Schelling calls this challenge the art of commitment. Scholars also generally concur that to demonstrate commitment and credibility, a compeller should use signals that incur costs. I call this paradigm the costly framework. According to this framework, the cost a compeller undertakes in sending a signal determines the commitment it conveys and its coercive utility. There are three types of signaling costs. Sunk costs, like financial expenditures, are incurred ex ante. A compeller also might convey commitment by manipulating the risk of an accidental war. Finally, a political leader might stake personal reputation and the nation's honor on the outcome of a signal. The political fallout, should that leader not fulfill a threat, effectively ties their hands. And these hand-tying political costs are called audience costs. Two types of signals best capture these costs. Military mobilizations, like deploying nuclear-capable bombers near Iran's borders, and public verbal threats by the president. Within the costly framework, there are a number of hypotheses about what makes a signal more costly and effective. The hand-tying versus cost-sinking debate asks, which type of signal, public threat, or military mobilization is more costly and therefore more effective? Fearon uses game theoretic models to argue that audience costs are more burdensome than sunk costs, and thus verbal threats should be more successful. A second hypothesis is that verbal threats that are explicit about the use of force or include an ultimatum incur more severe political costs and are therefore likely to be effective. Scholars also consider the relative costs of different military mobilizations. Some contend that ground troops are most credible because of the tremendous financial and organizational costs undertaken in deploying them. Others laud air power as the most effective because bombers can reach deep into an opponent's territory to quickly degrade its defenses. And a fourth school of thought relates to the effective international support for intervention. Building a coalition is politically, financially, and strategically costly, and might therefore be an effective compellant device. My analysis uses an original data set of every compellant military mobilization and public threat by the president since 1970 to evaluate how well these theories cohere with the historical record. To assemble a list of public threats, I consulted the American Presidency Project, which catalogs everything a president has ever publicly said. I analyzed 94,000 documents, and I also looked at presidential Twitter activity. To identify military mobilizations, I used the New York Times online archives and entered the keywords military and deploy, which populated 30,000 reports that I scanned. I used a similar process to record opponent responses to each signal, whether full concessions, partial concessions, or no concessions. Here is a summary of signaling frequency. Of the 541 signals that I identified, the majority were public threats, shown on the left, compared to mobilizations on the right. But what's really striking is that when you look at all signals combined, 93% of the 541 signals result in no concessions, as the first column shows. There's a 6% rate of partial concessions in the middle, and on the right, only a 1% record of full capitulation. Overall, successful signaling is quite rare. Now I have one more methodological note. To determine whether compellant signals can really be analyzed independently, I conducted several regression analyses testing how signals interact and accrue over the course of a dispute. Some of the variables I tested were the number of prior signals sent, a words-deeds ratio comparing prior threats to mobilizations, and time elapsed. But as I coded them, none of these variables had a significant effect on signaling outcome. And this apparent independence allows for a meaningful analysis of individual signals. This figure compares the effectiveness of hand-tying public threats in gray and cost-sinking mobilizations in red. The likelihood of no concessions on the left, partial and full, is the same to 0.1% for both types of signals. If audience costs are more burdensome than sunk costs, as Farron suggests, they still do not make a signal more effective. When looking in more detail at public threats, compared to vague threats in gray, explicit threats in blue are not more effective. And while an ultimatum in red makes partial concessions more likely, it has never led to full capitulation. These results suggest that more severe political costs do not make capitulation more likely. This graph compares the effectiveness of aerial mobilizations in gray, naval in blue, and ground in red. The data indicate that aerial mobilizations are the most effective in eliciting partial concessions. Although ground and naval are more costly, they are almost always ineffectual. I also tested a number of other variables, from providing negative assurances to targeting a nuclear-armed opponent, and whether the end of the Cold War marked a discontinuity in signaling effectiveness. Based on my coding, none of these were significant. Two variables that did matter were whether sanctions were in place and if Congress had authorized the use of force. However, these variables, which are financially and politically costly, were associated with a lower rate of concessions. Again, this suggests that more costly signals do not ensure more successful outcomes. This final figure compares unilateral signals in gray to signals with international support in red. International backing is associated with a higher rate of partial concessions in the middle, but has no significant bearing on achieving full capitulation on the right. Although assembling a coalition is very costly, it has a limited effect on compellence. Together, my results raise questions regarding the validity of the costly framework. Evidently, some of the most costly signals, like explicit threats and the deployment of ground troops, either have no influence or actually make success less likely. This is contrary to the current dogma, which is really surprising. So why might this be the case? Looking at the effect of international authorization for intervention is instructive for exploring why very costly signals might not be more effective. When it comes to the effect of international support, I propose that this may be due not only to the costs, but also the sequencing of coalition building. A common feature among my case studies of this variable is that the decision to pursue a coalition was made after the president felt that diplomacy was likely to fail. The purpose was to legitimize intervention and obtain logistical and warfighting assistance, with compellence as a second-order objective. The process is politically and financially costly, as well as strategically constraining, since it might involve watering down military objectives. I suspect that this process and these costs amplify an opponent's sensitivity to its own audience costs, making capitulation tantamount to political suicide. Instead, an opponent might adopt a wedge strategy of selective accommodation to splinter the coalition, hence partial but not full concessions. And this mechanism helps to explain why compellence failed prior to the first Gulf War. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. This was for two reasons. First, to relieve economic anxieties after the Iran-Iraq war by seizing Kuwait's oil fields. And second, to define Saddam as a pan-Arab leader following Egypt's rapprochement with Israel and the United States. As a senior Iraqi minister advised, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. On August 3rd, with no military options to expel Iraq, Bush settled for diplomatic and economic pressure. By mid-October, sanctions, embargoes, and 9 UN resolutions bore no fruit. Around that time, Bush reflected in his diary that he didn't believe coercion would work, that war was the likely outcome. He even hoped that Iraq might provoke the United States so that it could intervene. But without a catalyst, he chose another path, preparing to attack. And in early November, he deployed 150,000 more troops to the Gulf. Still, according to Iraqi archives, Saddam believed the United States might be bluffing. Meanwhile, Bush set out to obtain UN Security Council authorization to use force. This decision sought to legitimize intervention in the eyes of Arab partners and Congress, to remove logistical barriers like basing troops, and to prove the viability of the United Nations in the post-Cold War era. If a coalition ever were to compel Saddam to withdraw, this was the occasion. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the spectacle of the Malta summit reflected tectonic geopolitical changes as the United States and Soviet Union moved beyond containment and competition. Gorbachev and Bush envisioned a new world order of superpower partnership, and reversing Saddam's aggression was to be the hallmark of their efforts. After weeks of Bush and Jim Baker crisscrossing the globe to meet with foreign leaders, the Security Council passed Resolution 678, authorizing all necessary means should Saddam not withdraw by January 15th. Saddam's calculus changed dramatically. He soon became convinced that an attack by the United States was imminent. He deployed the Republican Guard to strategic locations, armed missiles with chemical weapons, and directed exercises in Baghdad to prepare for a nuclear strike. As he reflected in cabinet meetings, Saddam believed that with the world united against him, capitulating would not only undercut his pan-Arab designs, it would cost him his regime and perhaps even his life. Instead of capitulation, Saddam opted for a wedge strategy to break the coalition and obstruct intervention. His strategy had two components. The first was displaying seemingly good faith efforts to reach a peaceful settlement. A parade of diplomatic overtures ensued as dignitaries visited Baghdad for hours of talks that yielded little. Saddam even directed Tariq Aziz to meet with Baker in Geneva. The second component was selective accommodation. From the outset of the crisis, one of the most sensitive issues was Saddam's policy of using hostages as human shields. As he plotted in early August, these hostages would provide leverage against potential invaders. 1 week after Resolution 678, Saddam freed all hostages in order to pacify nations wary of military action like France and China, thus the observation of partial concessions. However, come January, he refused to relinquish Kuwait, dragging the United States and the world into war. Given the dataset and this case study, the costly framework might be re-examined. Findings from coalition effects to ground mobilizations suggest that a signal's cost and capacity to demonstrate commitment might at some point diminish its coercive value. My case studies raise a further question about the conventional logic of coercion. Whether a strategy's outcome is determined by the signals it comprises or by the intractability of the disputes that the United States becomes involved in. As the case of the first Gulf War suggests, decisions to pursue coalitions or other costly signaling devices might occur only in cases where compellents likely won't succeed. And while they appear to be for compellents, they might serve other purposes, including marshaling support for an anticipated war. Further case studies of these selection effects are one potential avenue for future research. My thesis has implications for scholars and strategists. It presents the most comprehensive data set on compellents to date, challenges some of the foundational theories of coercion, and provides initial evidence of selection effects in compellents. Policymakers should consider that effective signaling is rare, and that demonstrating an unflinching commitment to using force might not make success more likely. Ultimately, the definition of policy success matters a lot. If success means an immaculate outcome without war, strategists are likely to be disappointed. But if success means achieving an objective, whether peacefully or by force if necessary, it's important that we be aware of the complications and limitations to compellents. In closing, I would like to thank my advisors. Professor Sagan, thank you for your guidance and your support since my freshman year, and for introducing me to political science in the first place. Working with you on my thesis has truly been the highlight of my time at Stanford. Secretary Rice, thank you for inspiring me to reach a new level of analysis while staying committed to my character and heart. Thank you also to Professors Ziegart and Ewing and Dr. Meir for running the honors program. And I also want to thank Secretary Perry and Professor Hecker, Professor Blacker, for their mentorship for over 3 years. And to my other mentors, friends, and family members who are here today to support me, thank you very much. I look forward to our discussion.
All right, well done, Jonah. So we've had an exercise in compellence failure as Fondiar put up his stop sign, but the thank yous were so lovely, we just kept going. As is our custom, we'll turn to Professor Sagan, then Professor Rice. Let me remind folks, if you're just tuning in, if you're in the classroom, raise your hand or click your raise hand button. If you're tuning in as an audience member, you can ask your question by typing it into either the chat tab at the bottom of your screen or the appropriately titled Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll go to the class first, and then we'll open it up to as many questions as we can. Professor Sagan.
Well, first of all, that was an excellent presentation. There was a very famous incident that went viral a number of years ago of the BBC dad that I think everybody knows about, the interrupted talk by little kids. Jonah and I had a CISAC mom experience recently where our penultimate conversation about this thesis was interrupted by Jonah's mom coming into the background to bring him a snack. So congratulations for you for not having that moment today. I have one big question for you here. What do your case study leaves an observer, as you did suggest at the end, was that many, what appears to be many threats, compellant threats, are done after the compeller already knows that war is likely, and yet they keep making threats. Can you explain why that would be the case? Are they truly trying to bring up some kind of legitimacy to domestic politics at home? Are they doing this for alliance politics? And if you recommend at the end that this challenges previous theories, wouldn't it behoove you at the end to say, well, here's how one could try to measure that, and what percentage or what way you could measure that phenomenon as opposed to true efforts of compellence?
Great. Thank you very much for the question. I'll start with the first part. Now, when Robert Art and Patrick Cronin published a really famous book on coercive diplomacy. They mentioned that there are cases where a president thinks that compellence will fail, but still makes a compellent effort. And they call this, I believe they call it a false effort. They really see it as kind of duplicitous. I disagree. I think that compellence, while we need to be aware of the limitations, actually is attempted as part of an effort to build legitimacy and show that no stone has been left unturned before resorting to military force. I think the case of the first Gulf War shows that actually Bush invited Saddam Hussein for a personal meeting after the UN resolution in a public display to show his good faith. And I think it's important that if the United States is going to go to war or to use military force, it demonstrates that it actually has put the initiative in an opponent's hands. Let the target decide what the course of action will be, not only for public support and for legitimacy, but as a matter of good faith and showing what the United States stands for. And in terms of the second part of the question, measuring the selection effects, I think that this really lends itself to more case studies. I would look at the sequencing of decisions to pursue compellent strategies. Colin Powell has a very famous quote when he talks about the effect of an ultimatum as a compelling signal. He said that before going to war against Afghanistan in 2001, President Bush had to give the Taliban an ultimatum because no civilized society goes to war without a clear last chance. And I think a case study on ultimata would be really fruitful for showing that this compellent device, which is theorized by a lot of scholars like Alexander George and Paul Huth, I believe, Paul Lauren, actually is not so much a compellent device as much as a means of displaying good faith and putting a good face to the United States before resorting to force.
Okay, Professor Rice.
Very brief question, and then I'm going to ask you a slightly unfair question. So the very brief question is, you, I think, do a very good job of showing that very often the opponent is really just going to respond through a wedge strategy and hope for the best. So we know in Gulf War I that not only was it a matter of trying to get Baker to meet with Tariq Aziz, but it was also trying to get the Russians or the Soviet Union to break with the coalition somehow. And some could say that in the second Gulf War, Saddam was actually pretty effective at doing that. So can you say just a word more about this wedge strategy? Because if that is actually where the opponent goes, that's very important to understanding why compellence might actually not work for full concession. The slightly unfair question is, you've done a great job on compellence, but on one of your first slides, you also had deterrence up there. So can you just muse for a moment? It would be another thesis, but just to think. What do you say, though, about deterrence and costliness? And this, for instance, we very often employ tripwires to demonstrate commitment in order to deter. Some would say that for the 45 plus years of the Cold War, that was actually a very successful strategy where the Soviet Union was concerned. We also have a tripwire in South Korea. It's not really to defeat the opponent, it's to demonstrate commitment that you will in fact go to war. So first of all, I'll talk a little bit more about this wedge strategy, which I think is I think you underplay the importance of that finding in your work. And secondly, just muse for us a little bit on the deterrence piece and costliness.
Okay, well, thank you very much. When it comes to the wedge strategy, I think a really telling quote is actually from Napoleon Bonaparte, who was famous for pursuing a wedge strategy in the Napoleonic Wars. And he said, if I have to fight, let it be against a coalition. I think coalitions, whether it's alliance politics or varying tolerance thresholds of the use of force, are really susceptible to internal disagreements. And these disagreements are publicly displayed, whether it's China abstaining from a UN Security Council vote, which is very public, or President George H.W. Bush's internal advisors like Primakov being vocal about their hesitation about the use of force. It's easy for an opponent to target what the particular vulnerability within a coalition is. In the first Gulf War, that was hostages. And secondly, to exploit that vulnerability by inviting, showing false but apparent good faith efforts at resolving a dispute peacefully. And it's, it can be seen as a limitation to coalition, but, ultimately there's still a dispute about whether wedge strategies really are effective. Some of them certainly are very effective, but it also might depend what the stake is in the crisis, whether it's reversing aggression. That's really an imperative, the foundational norm of the international order. Now, when it comes to deterrence, I think deterrence is interestingly less costly for the United States and for the opponent. For the United States, pursuing deterrence often is unstated. It doesn't involve the president making a public declaration of a red line, although there are certainly cases of that. So there might be fewer audience costs. That's one theory that might be tested in future studies. And for an opponent, there are actually there are some really interesting studies on why deterrence is more effective than compellence. And one of the conclusions is that in deterrence, it's easier for an opponent to concede to an American demanded policy. There is less of what's called face at stake. An opponent can comply while still publicly harboring its initial intention. Thomas Schelling has a great quote in Arms and Influence. He says, the deterrence barrier that we have established through China is clear to see, but still the Chinese say that they'll take Quemoy, I'm not trying to pronounce it, in their own time. So there is a different level of face at stake. I think that in a deterrent scenario, it's easier to block a move than it is to change a decision. And again, a great Schelling quote is that he compares an opponent with its bureaucracies and its multi-layered organizations as old arthritics. And if you're going to compel them to move, it's really hard to convince every person in a chain to do so. But if you're going to block a door and make sure that the arthritics can't pass, then that's something that's really a very achievable objective.
Good.
Okay, so thank you so much for these questions. What I would propose we do is we have in the class 3 questions. We have a number of people in the audience asking. So what I'd like to do, and they're excellent questions, we will collect for all of our presenters the questions from the audience because I think they're going to be helpful for their theses. We're going to do speed dating round. I have Dr. Hecker, Dr. Call, Dr. McFall. So Sig, we'll go to you first. If you can ask your question, then we'll turn to Colin, and then we'll turn to Mike, and then Jonah, you can wrap us up. Sig.
Thank you, Jonah. Really great job. I enjoyed it very much. I just had the simple question. When you do the actual numerical analysis, the probabilities of various things, particularly when it comes to full capitulation versus partial capitulation, how easy is it to define that? And how much does the side, for example, in the United States, actually want full capitulation? So it wasn't clear to me how you can get such specific statistics on the issue of capitulation versus partial capitulation.
Colin.
Great. Hey, Jonah, fantastic job. So I have, my question might be a little unfair along the lines of Secretary Rice's second question, but obviously in January, Trump authorized the killing of Qasem Soleimani in retaliation for the attack on American troops by Iranian proxies. And the stated goal, or among the stated goals, was to reestablish deterrence. And I wonder how conceptually, and you see this term a lot, by the way, especially and increasingly by the Pentagon and by the Israelis, et cetera, using force to reestablish deterrence. I wonder in your framework, where does that fit? Because deterrence has failed, right? And so this is aiming to prevent an actor from continuing a pattern of ongoing behavior, that is, to prevent them from doing something again. And so it seems to mix kind of deterrence and compellence together. I wonder if you could comment on that. And in that vein, Trump has obviously issued lots of threats against Iran by tweet. We've deployed a bunch of additional forces to the Middle East, and we've demonstrated the willingness to use force directly against Iran and its proxies. And yet Iran keeps doing these things. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the prospects for success in reestablishing deterrence or compelling Iran to stop. And if it won't succeed, what would be better?
Mike.
Jonah, great job. Two quick questions. First, what does Firon think? You invoked him. You've told him that all of his work has been undermined by your evidence. So I want to know what his rebuttal is. But secondly, more seriously, your case confirms the overwhelming statistical data you have, but in the margins in the statistical data, you had some other cases, other successes, let's call them that. And I wonder if you could pick one of the cases you know the best where you coded it as a partial success and then explain what conditions were different for that success. I want to know what explains variation here. When I was listening to you, I was just reading a book by Derek Chalet where he talks a lot about Syria and the threat of use of force against Syria. And then there was concessions. I'm just presenting his coding of the case. You may have a different coding where there were concessions, right? When he gave up his chemical weapons. So how would you explain that case versus the overwhelming ones that you have in your data set? But pick a case that you know the best and just explain why there's some variation, even if very little.
Okay, I'll start with Professor Hecker. In terms of the data, one methodology that I borrowed is actually, I borrowed the methodology from Sexer and Furman, who looked at opponent responses to threats. They have a very different study otherwise, but they coded responses as no concessions, partial concessions, or full concessions. Now, the way that I measured that is almost every public threat that a president made has a specific demand, whether that's clearly stated, like Iran, stop your support for proxy forces and terrorism, or whether it's the official policy of the United States. For example, after the 1998 Iraq Liberation Act, which Congress passed, many of the demands were also of Iraq that Saddam Hussein stepped down. So that's how I went through the demands. And then I looked at opponent responses and compared that to demands. And I only looked at material changes. So I didn't include summit diplomacy, statements of principles. For instance, when it comes to the JCPOA, I only counted it once it was implemented by Iran. And if a response fully satisfied all of the conditions that were stipulated by the United States, I counted that as full concessions. If, for instance, Saddam Hussein let in some UN inspectors, but really didn't really give them a chance to do their work, that's partial concessions. And does the United States want full capitulation? I think so. I think, yeah. I think it's reasonable to, it might be reasonable to expect that we want them to capitulate so that we don't have to go to war, but there are cases where it's expected that if an opponent fully capitulates, we'll use force anyways. And the 1991 first Gulf War actually is one of those cases. Now, Professor Call, when it comes to the Soleimani strike, right, and restoring deterrence, actually the introduction of my thesis talks about how deterrence is quickly becoming a catch-all term for any coercive strategy. When Secretary Pompeo came to speak at Stanford, he said that his objective with Iran was real deterrence. Then he went on to say, we just want Iran to behave like Norway. That's a compellent objective. And it's important to understand that compellence is really harder than deterrence for the reasons that I laid out for Secretary Rice. And we got to know what we're doing if we're going to actually implement the strategy correctly, because each one inherits unique challenges. And on Trump's threats, it's interesting to note that most of Trump's threats are actually deterrent threats. Fire and Fury, the Iran threats, they're really deterrent threats rather than compelling threats. I think Trump is a little bit more reserved, shows greater forbearance with compellence, which is kind of in line with his overall grand strategy of withdrawing and securing America's vital interests without using force unnecessarily. And prospects for success with Iran. I think, gosh, if I knew that question, hopefully I could, do something about it. But I think one strategy that, I think one thing that we should note is, first of all, you have to have some levels of communication. You need to have a hotline to prevent the risk of war, because that's one way that we manipulate and convey credibility. That's really, that's one way we do it. I would start with restoring communication channels. And the final thing, Professor McFall, I've talked to Firon, who's really helpful, and I'm sure we're going to continue talking. It showed in my data set. And one case briefly is the invasion of Haiti in 1994. Cedras actually abdicated power, but only once President Clinton had announced the invasion had started. So that's kind of an edge case. Other cases are Libya giving the suspects of the Pan Am bombing over to the International Court of Justice, and restoring democracy in Ukraine in 2004. There are really very few consistent themes throughout the successful cases, which is one reason to be aware and alert to how complicated the strategy really is. Hopefully I made that fast enough.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, from China to Russia to compellence. Antigone, Kelly, Jonah, amazing job, all three of you. Faculty advisors, thank you for coming. Big applause for all three students. Let me just remind everyone, the presentations continue. So same bat time, same bat channel, next Thursday and the Thursday after from 1:30 to 3:20. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Yeah, good job.
Well done.